Hello and welcome to another episode of The Living Philosophy. I'm here with Seán from Deep Noetics. We were on a live stream together with PF Jung last weekend, and it was really fascinating. We only overlapped for a few minutes, but Seán reached out and just it seemed to be some fascinating potentials for conversation. So we're going to try and explore a little bit of that. Seán, I don't know if there's any bit of an introduction you want to give or...
Yeah, sure. Well, I started my channel like a year back. I did an internship at the Center for Future of Intelligence in Cambridge, and they kind of researched the ethics of AI and technology and these things. And I personally felt like there was a bit of a lack of a more continental perspective on these things. A lot of it was very analytic philosophy / science fiction views, and these kind of mainstream books that came about, like Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence. These things, they never touch upon people like Baudrillard, never touch upon people like Foucault and these people. Not that I insist on it, but then I thought I kind of would set up my own kind of thing, talking about technology, talking about the age of the machine. And yeah, I got in touch with Johannes Niederhauser, for anyone who knows him, and we'll be teaching a course at Halkyon Guild at his platform, beginning on the 14th of May, beginning next weekend, and it's going to be the philosophy of the machine. So we're going to look at how techniques has kind of taken hold of science, of our ideologies, of our relationship to nature.
And what's technics are? Technics is our relation to technology, or?
Yeah, so in German, they make a difference between like Technologie and Technik, right? So there's the famous essay that I highly praise is the question concerning technology by Heidegger. But in German, it's called Die Frage nach der Technik. So literally translated word by word, it would be the question after techniques, right? And what he speaks about there is it's not looking for an essence of technology, but techniques is more seen as the realm of the technical in the immanent world. It's it's not individual tool usage, but it's like the realm of the technical. It's like if you can conceptualize the internet as some sort of cybernetic machine, and which is kind of confronting us, but which we're also part of. And there's a lot of interesting writers that have spoken about these things as well, like especially Deleuze and Nick Land. I don't know to what degree you're familiar with them, but there's, I think, a pressing need to look at these things, especially now that it's happening. We're getting all these crazy developments at a rapid speed, and I think we are kind of, by the mainstream Western philosophy, we've kind of started off a bit, I would say, intellectually unprepared to an extent.
For what's coming technologically?
Yes.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so before we dig into that, I'm kind of curious about, because you seem to have like a bit of a double background, because you're studying at the Max Planck University, yes. Is it? And you're studying mathematics, or?
Well, currently my degree is called Neuroengineering. So it is that merger of man and machine. So neuroengineering focuses on brain-computer interaction, brain-computer interfaces. So it goes into neurobiology, but also into AI, neural networks, and signal processing, electrical engineering to an extent. And my background was in theoretical physics, and so I kind of missed it. So I tried to bring them together, and now I'm doing research on mathematical models of complex systems.
Okay, so that's fascinating, and that's something that's a whole fascinating package that I wouldn't expect to go with continental philosophy. Even at that, it seems like did you come to continental philosophy from a different direction, or was that part of those studies, or where did those studies fit in?
I mean, especially it was kind of a balance. I feel like I got a lot into this very scientific mindset, very theoretical scientific mindset, and since the victory of Newton over Leibniz, physics and science is very much dominated, Anglo-Western dominated, right? You could say it is, the underlying philosophy is more or less a kind of implicit materialistic or physicalist analytic thinking, right? And what my friend Johannes says is Harry Potter is a good representation of that sort of thinking, because you have this sort of very narrow framework of analytic philosophy. You have to kind of at the same time have a strange parallel believe in magic or in science fiction or something. So you know, the muggles and the wizards all use the same train station in Harry Potter, because they've kind of crammed both into one place. And then this is kind of how I see the views on AI and this technology nowadays. It's like either purely technical, looking at the, you know, value engineering and all these things of these systems, and then, or it's sci-fi, like, or you get the other kind of pole at the same time, and nothing kind of reconciling them or in between. Or it's like the machine is going to become conscious and it needs human rights and it's going to potentially kill us all.
And do you think that that's an unconscious? Do you think that that's like a Jungian shadow bleed through of, like, because there's such a focus on the materialist side, that it's this, that fantasy metaphysical side shows up in sci-fi? Or how do you see the relation of those things?
Yes, I would say definitely. I think it's this paradoxical myth of the logos replacing the mythos, right? It's this paradox that, like, the logos replacing the mythos, that it's in itself is an insane kind of extreme mythos, right? It's an insane myth.
Okay, I like that. Yeah, that's
and you see that a lot in postmodernist thinkers, where they try, I think postmodernity is this fragmentation, this dissociation of this rationalist logical paradigm, and trying to then, you know, bring these different fragments together again to reconcile it with sort of mythos in a way. And because no single mind seems to be yet capable of really doing that, what you get are just artistic different kind of expressions of that are only partially complete.
So you think there's an attempt to get back to the mythic with postmodernism?
I wouldn't know if it's conscious with most. I would say it's conscious with some. I have said that I consider Jordan Peterson, for example, a right-wing or conservative postmodernist. And I would say in his case, or some people like, for example, John Vervaeke, if you're familiar with him, I would say there it's kind of conscious. They actually are, you know, consciously, I don't know if they're consciously being postmodern. I would claim they are.
I think with Vervaeke, I know he's actually got a conscious relationship with the postmoderns. I remember seeing the interview between him and Jordan Peterson. He was just correcting him on some stuff around Foucault, and he was actually aware of the tradition and had studied the tradition somewhat. So with him, I think there's probably a level of being conscious of it and trying to integrate all these things. Whereas with Peterson, it's just kind of a blind spot.
Yeah.
But you were saying something fascinating before we started recording about because I was saying how the Freudians seem to be more, Freud seems to be more in vogue with the postmodern, like we'll say continental philosophy, whereas Jung is more of either hippie spiritual or else this Jordan Peterson type of thing. And you were saying that there's a double tradition.
I don't know if it's fair to say Freud is more of a continental kind of thing.
Sorry, that the continentals have studied more out of Freud. So Lacan, like there's a much more of a direct line to Freud than there is to Jung. Whereas it seems like the tree is split off. So who was the writer you were saying that said that?
That was Marcuse, and always to be taken with a pinch of salt, because Marcuse is from the late Frankfurt School, right? They have like an early generation with Adorno and Horkheimer and these people, and then they have a late.
So is he like Habermas's time, or?
Yeah. Marcuse, Habermas are the most famous, let's say, representatives of the late Frankfurt School. And the Frankfurt School, I mean, they do merge Freudianism with Marxism to an extent. And I would say they are roughly what one could refer to as neo-Marxists. However, most of their actual representatives were not postmodernists. Like they were not really into all of this deconstructionist or whatever you want to call it.
So it's almost
philosophy.
like the postmodern and the neo-Marxist traditions are completely separate in a way. There's like the French postmodernism and the Frankfurtian neo-Marxism, or do you think that there's an overlap there?
I would say they're also different in structure. I would say like postmodernism, there's even postmodernist art, there's even postmodernist I guess music. I'm not sure about that, but it's more of like a general term for a movement, but I would doubt that there's some sort of explicit collaborated, brainstorming going on between all of these French people. Whereas with the Frankfurt School, I would say they are actually kind of subscribing to a particular school of thought. They are kind of agreed to follow this sort of Freudo-Marxian analysis. It is more explicitly a particular, club you belong to, if you follow that path.
Yeah, so it's kind of, the Frankfurt School is kind of like a think tank that have their own like core set of ideas, whereas the French are more, while those different so-called postmodernist thinkers would be influenced by each other, they're definitely not part of a core tradition that would identify as postmodernism.
Yeah, they don't have a postmodernist kind of manifesto that adheres to the same author. You have to follow Nietzsche and Heidegger or whatever it is. They often do, but it doesn't mean that it's sort of set in stone.
Yeah, so it's like, from what I was looking at, it seemed like there was the existentialist strain, and that was kind of evolving out of Heidegger, like the phenomenological thing coming in. And then there was structuralism. So Levi Strauss kind of was the first to put aside the existential kind of the domination of Sartre, we'll say. And then you had the post-structuralists, so kind of gathering around, fascinated by this new structural paradigm, where people like Barthes, Foucault, I guess Derrida, although Derrida seems to be his own, like off in America, kind of on his own trip. And Deleuze, like these seem to be writers that working in France and kind of like closely connected. And there seems to have been a drawing back with them, fascinated by structuralism, but going back to Nietzsche, very much becoming more Nietzschean thinkers, and that becoming a dominant strain coming through. Is that an accurate kind of?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say necessarily I'm an expert on these things. It sounds accurate.
So how much have you actually studied them? How much of these have you read? Have you read more of the Frankfurt School, or have you read more of the, what's your relationship with postmodernism? Because obviously it's not your main subject matter.
Right. I am a fan, and I've been interested in reading specifically more Deleuze and Baudrillard.
Cool.
Especially because of my course, the philosophy of the machine, which is based on a book I'm writing, or a text I'm writing, which is specifically focusing on this age of the machine, this kind of, you could say, phenomenology of techniques. And I feel like...
Yeah, sorry, I was watching your interview with Niederhauser, or a clip from it, and he was like, all Deleuze talks about is the machine. So Deleuze must be perfect for you, if that's the case. He
must be perfect for me, right? Yeah, and I don't really fully follow Johannes Niederhauser there, because he's not a big fan of Deleuze.
Yeah, he just dismissed him out of hand, and I was like, no, wait, this isn't what I came to this video for. I want to, like, you're talking about Nietzsche and Deleuze. Where's the Deleuze? He's like, exactly. This guy's too hard to read. And it's like, they're all hard to read. That's the point. They're trying to get at something that language makes it hard to get at.
Yes, I think with Deleuze, there's a specific difference, though, where I think to an extent he purposely made himself incomprehensible in some of his texts, not all. Yeah. There is a work by him on Foucault, for example. There's different other works that are more scholarly, philosophically written. However, his kind of the stuff he's famous for, the Anti-Oedipus, the Thousand Plateaus, these kind of works, they are what kind of set the basis for what is called Schizo Analysis. And Schizo Analysis, as the title also Anti-Oedipus suggests, it's a radical break against Freud and Freudianism. So it is a kind of, you could say, leftist tradition that actively distinguishes itself from the Frankfurt School, which is inherently very Freudian. And it claims that the Frankfurt School, which which is accurate. The Frankfurt School is kind of becomes part of the capitalist dynamic itself. So in a sense, ironically, the critique of the Frankfurt School becomes part of what capitalism represents. And that is something that was then further explored by one of the most famous Deleuzians, Nick Land, most famous and infamous Deleuzians, I should say, Nick Land, who basically identifies capitalism to be critique. He kind of says that capitalism is the continuous critique of capitalism for more capitalism.
Right, okay.
Right.
That's interesting.
So in a way, ironically, all of these ideologies, these leftist ideologies that critique capitalism, they ironically are part of the system. They're needed for the system to keep revolutionizing its productive forces. And
yeah, okay, yeah, because I'm reading bits around Marx now, and I'm just like, oh, this is like they've been swept up in the same thing, and like if anything, Marxism probably undermined itself by making that class consciousness conscious, and then there was the Marxists that came along in Western Europe seemed to have brought in reforms which probably took the edge off the energy, and that probably stopped revolution from happening because they'd made it conscious to some degree. So it kind of kept the dialectic within a capitalist framework rather than letting that shadow build up so much. Kind of like Trump, like that shadow never got made conscious before the system exploded and you have a reality TV star as your president. So that Marx seems to have like stopped. So that's actually a really interesting point. In a way that like Baudrillard, thinking about him and simulation, it seems to have gone a completely different direction where he's just like, we're locked in. And trying to understand Baudrillard and talking about simulation, I was just like, I need to read all of this guy's previous works because I know I haven't grasped this concept that it seems like we're just walled in. And then for one further point to throw at you to see how you mix all this together was Deleuze's idea of the rhizome. So rather than this linear pattern of knowledge, a rhizome is like a root system out of which all like the plant can spring up at any point. So it's like a root system that is generated from different points. And I was reading an article that the internet is the perfect image of a rhizomatic system, because you've, rather than a linear top down or bottom up kind of structure, it's this immense field of like, it can crop up anywhere. There's so many different nodes at which it's pointing in, and it's this living dynamic system that is much more has much more depth than any kind of linear structuring of the system, which probably ties in with Foucault's idea of force relations and this network of stuff that we're living in. So the postmodernists seem to be trying to figure out the box that we're in a way that hasn't gotten swept up. And I think the reaction to postmodernism as being so much like, this thing is evil, like what are they doing, these are just complete relativists, points to something important being there of like, I don't think they're doing what you think they're doing. Right. You know what I mean? Like something fascinating about the phenomenon of the relationship between mainstream culture and postmodernism as this boogeyman. So I know I've thrown quite a lot there. I don't know how you can package that together, but
well, so I would say that if you look at Deleuze now with this idea of schizo analysis versus psychoanalysis, meaning that the integrity of the human psyche as a sort of coherent ego, that itself is a reactionary position. That is the claim, more or less. That Oedipus, the whole theory that's behind Freudianism, that it is there to maintain a sort of hierarchical bourgeois structure, and that the schizo is the subject of the modern age, specifically with the internet, where the schizo no longer follows a tree-like structure.
So what exactly do we mean by schizo? Is this?
It's not a clinical term.
Yeah.
The schizo means a sort of deterritorialized subject. It is a kind of the lines of flight, the lines of thoughts, they dissociate in ways that are no longer following a sort of, let's say, traditional tree structure, right? A traditional tree structure of like top hierarchy, lower hierarchy, but it is rather something that approaches more what you just mentioned, a rhizome. It is the kind of rhizome is opposed to the tree. Whereas now in terms of the internet, I would kind of disagree to an extent and would say the internet is, as the name suggests, it's a network. And a network is usually not completely random. It's usually not completely rhizomatic. It's usually scale-free, meaning that there's nodes that are highly connected, and then there's nodes that are less connected, and it's very few nodes that have most of the connections. And in the internet, you can see that most people are speaking via a very small number of platforms that own most of the largest servers with the biggest traffic. So in a sense, he's foreseen the rhizome as the kind of potential way out. But I would say that it is yet to come, potentially with things like Web3, with things like decentralization, whatever, crypto. I'm not sure. I'm not an oracle.
I'm wondering whether have you heard? I don't know how much Jordan Peterson you've watched, but if you've ever come across the Pareto distributions.
Yes.
So that there's a geometric pattern of the more something accumulates a certain type of power or a certain type of resource, the more it will get. So to those who have, more shall be given. To those who not, it shall be taken away. It seems like with the internet, you start off with this relatively balanced field, and then as gravity takes over, there's just clumps of power that tend to collect, and people are like, oh, I want to know where to go. Well, okay, this is the place I went last time. And the more people go for those well-traveled tracks, the deeper those tracks become, and that track becomes a trail, becomes a road, becomes a highway, becomes a Facebook or an Instagram or a Reddit. And so is this a natural dynamic that we can start off with something being rhizomatic, but does rhizomatic always end up? And you could think of all these different thinkers that have been throughout time and probably haven't become part of the great tradition, the linear arborist tradition of philosophy, that was really people like Democritus or the sophists who kind of fell off because they didn't fit with that arborist structure. And so does the rhizomatic structure always give way to something arboresque? Do you think that could possibly be a dynamic of power within these systems?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say a good way to look at it is also instead of the tree, look at the fungus. I read the book called Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. I can very much recommend it. And he even mentions Deleuze in it, and says that that what Deleuze was more or less referring to is the fungal network. The fungal network is kind of structured as this kind of decentralized
also, the mycelial network is a better idea than the rhizomatic.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And I would say there. So the Pareto distribution, I would say, is obviously to be found in a lot of circumstances. The reason why it hasn't crushed every human society ever is because there's not only one game to play, right? So if you are at the lower end of almost all of the Pareto distributions, but you manage to get up onto the higher end in one, that'll do it for you. It's enough to succeed in one out of 1,000 of these distributions. It's enough for you to succeed in one. And then once you have multiple ones, then then it kind of balances itself out again. And I would say that's the difference here. So you will have things like nodes with a lot of connections. You will have these tension points in a network, I would say, regardless. However, right now, these tension points are kind of the relics of the old system, right? Right now, they are legal corporate entities, right? And the internet is quickly doing away with all of these ancien regimes, with all of these old structures. It's quickly doing away with it for
what are the
historical
ancien
time.
regimes in this narrative? What are we talking about when you're saying?
What we're talking about is we're talking about are joint stock global corporations, right? And they are a thing that specifically arose in the colonial time, late colonial time, and beginning of the 20th century. You had the big oil corporations, but before that, in colonial times, the basics were set, especially with trading companies, right? East India trading companies, the Hudson Bay companies, these companies. they are they're old regime kind of structures, because you always had the power structure of the power monopoly. You had the rulers, the monarchs, whatever, and you always also had the traders, the merchants, which especially had their golden age, their rise, whatever, around the
And you think the internet has
Enlightenment.
done away with that, or
I don't think the internet has done away with it, but I'd say that the structures according to which they're built are very quickly being revolutionized. You know what I mean? So the way a Facebook or a whatever what they're called now, Meta, has to be organized, has to be way more differently structured, way smarter, way more dynamic than now, whatever, an oil company in the last century, right? And I would say that, like, if you have the deterritorialization going on with the internet, you will have tension points, you will have nodes, highly connected nodes, just of a different nature. They don't necessarily have to be these multinational corporations. Just like if you assume we'll manage this utopia of there being like a digital village or something, then these tension points could be just something akin to public squares, right? Akin to public squares that are owned by no one or by everyone, whatever. Public squares. Of course, this is sounding utopian. I'm just speaking.
Well, that was kind of that was the dream of the internet.
Yeah.
Was utopian spaces, and it was maybe there for about 1 or 2 years, if even, like chat rooms and stuff. But I kind of just want to dig down in the deterritorialization and the distinction between internet age organizations, we say, and ancien regime, because it's like they seem to have a very similar powers. Well, to my mind, they would have a very similar power structure of, like, they've centered this power, created, well, you could say the platform element is different, but you've got this person on top, all these middle managers, although Meta is now sweeping them away, and then all the coders and business workers at the base. It seems to be just a new type, and it's a publicly traded company. Like, what am I missing there? That's the distinction.
Well, to an extent, yes, you're right. You have the old structure, especially because the core of a lot of what they're built on is very ancient for technological time, let's say, very ancient, namely law, common law, constitutional law, all of these things. These are, for technological time standards, these are like ancient, they're archaic, right? You get these, a lot of these laws were put in place by people who were wearing wigs and, you know, come traveling by horse, right? So, and we're still structuring our businesses according to these laws, right? So in a lot of ways, yes, you will have, and even on Web3, even if you start your most cutting edge tech business or something, you will follow some sort of structure that has been there 200 years ago as well. I would say a lot of the change is coming about through the deterritorialization, through the decentralization of the network via modern technologies. You have even the big corporations working way more decentralized, especially in terms of also subcontracting, and we have this boom, and it's not necessarily a good thing, but we have this boom of like consulting companies, and then consulting companies for consulting companies, and even your management has been outsourced to a large extent to these other companies, and like there's a lot of this kind of you know, dynamic on-off relationships and subcontracting and outsourcing relationships, whereas I'm not sure if I'm misrepresenting the history of economics here, whereas how I understand it is big corporations used to own pretty much most of its actual working space, most of its actual resources, most of it, down to the drilling equipment and the staff at the spot. Mining
they were much more vertically
owned...
integrated. Yeah, they had most of their business was structured within themselves. But I would still have thought, I guess I can understand the point with the contractors is a very good one, and consultants, that has become much more of a thing. And that seems to have been the main problem with the military industry complex in America, like money just going into a black hole, and their medical institution as well. But I still would have thought that I assume they still have all their own supercomputers that they have. You know, I know they've built these. COVID has probably changed things a lot in this regard as well, but they had these massive campuses where everyone went, and they had like these physical nodes which were kind of mirrors of and San Francisco was the giant node of the Silicon Valley, that consciousness in our entire society. So yeah, I don't know if I'm getting hung up on this idea of deterritorialization, but I'm just trying to figure out what that means within the broader scale of it.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it as in like, look at things like Uber or Airbnb, right? So they kind of still offer the platform. They have the servers rented, right? They have the supercomputers, if you will. However, Airbnb does not own a ton of hotels. They do not own thousands of apartments.
Right. So we're kind of talking about the platform idea of like Uber is a platform for cars. Yeah, Airbnb a platform. They don't own any of the property. They're just providing a marketplace within which that a certain type of interaction happens. And the same for all social media for different types of, if you're sharing your photos, you're sharing your posts, you're sharing your creative output, if you're sharing videos, then there's a decentralized thing insofar as they're not producing most of what's on their thing. They're kind of just providing a space and then soaking up the money that comes into that space then.
It's like the difference between like a superstore and a mall. If you look at the Ancien Regime correspondence, you know, where you have one shop kind of selling everything, owning all the products in there, or one shop just letting other shops open the shop, right?
That's interesting. So how does that fit into this neuroengineering power landscape that we're living in? Or
yeah, so that is an interesting one. When it comes to these technologies, AI, neuroengineering, I would say these are like, we're beginning now to enter these so-called transhumanist technologies. Specifically, which are mostly mentioned are neuroengineering, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology, like gene editing, these kind of things. And recently, not too long ago, 2 or 3 years ago, the German military jointly published a document with the UK Ministry of Defence on human augmentation, human enhancement technologies, and their application in warfare, more or less, right?
Right.
And
this isn't just exoskeletons. This is actually getting into actually implanting stuff within human. We're making the Borg, basically, is it?
Well, there's a lot of different things mentioned, among which were exoskeletons, but there's a lot of possibilities arising here on the horizon. And the thing to look at here is where is the power distributed? You know, you have people that have very good intentions, and I do not deny the use for people, especially that have paralysis. For me, that's the number one kind of practical use, because paralysis is a terrible fate, and if you can help people with that, you know, more power to you. However, if you look at who actually has the power over determining the direction this is going, it is not the idealists, well-intentioned colleagues of mine, co-students of mine, right?
Well, I mean, you could have even said that was the case a couple of years ago, like that Google was being very careful. They were doing all this AI work, but they were being very careful about not letting the genie out of the bottle. And they were trying to kind of, if you want to give a very charitable, I haven't studied enough, but this would be the charitable story with Google, that they were being very good caretakers of the possibilities of that, but then race to the bottom market dynamics of like ChatGPT came out, Microsoft threw money at that because they saw a chance to cut Google off at the knees. Now Google is like, well, I guess we just got to like plow on and get into the market. And now Elon Musk is kind of saying, well, I'm going to make an AI company as well, because, you know, me and Sam Altman fell out, so I'm going to try and get back in on the action. So it seems like the market dynamics of competition are now, even if there was an idealistic person who was kind of trying to caretake this knowledge well and be very cautious about it, because of the nature of the system, it would drive it into a disastrous space anyway. Like it would just be, we just have to pray that what waits us at the end of the journey is an AI that's wiser than us. That's about the best hope you have, because there's no restraint going to come because of those market dynamics. Or that's the way I see it anyway. That it's just the genie's out of the bottle, and now they're just racing ahead, and regulators are about a million miles behind before they'll catch up with any of this.
Right, and the regulators are often the best example of the ancien regime, right? You look at them, they're often like 80-year-old senators in the United States or something, right?
I mean, there's that famous thing of like when Mark Zuckerberg came before Congress the first time, and someone asked him, how does Facebook make money? And it was like, oh, dude, you should not be the person who's regulating this if you don't know about the ad model. This is scary.
When these Ukrainian when these US documents were leaked about Ukraine or something, I heard, I don't know if that's true, but I heard they were leaked on a Discord Minecraft server.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I didn't hear it was Minecraft.
I was just waiting. I was just hoping and waiting for them to get the CEO of Minecraft to be questioned and ask them, what do you do in Minecraft?
Why are you mining our secrets?
Is it true that you can make craft weapons in your game?
Why do you hate the United States, you unpatriotic? Yeah, it's painful when you think that, yeah, okay, you want people who have solid heads on their shoulders, but those people should have some idea of what's actually going on in the world. And so the scary thing is, like, not only does regulation, because the gears and cogs of the machine of bureaucracy take so long to catch up, but then the people who are riding that behemoth don't have a fucking clue what's going on, or can quite often be out of touch. So there's like, I don't know how much hope I have as that being the saving grace. So yeah,
exactly, and often it is exactly part of the problem. It's like the critique of capitalism becoming part of capitalism,
which fits with Baudrillard, right? This idea of the thing being taken up in the simulation. It all just becomes part of the greater globe of nonsense that's spinning and traps us ever more.
Yes, and that's the thing. I would say the machine, people would describe it as anti-fragile. The opposite of robustness is like, in a sense that everything to attack it makes it stronger. It's anti-fragile in a sense, whereas our ideologies are self-defeating prophecies. Like you said with Marx, it kind of became a self-defeating prophecy. And that's kind of what Baudrillard more or less talks about that, like, all of these ideologies we have, they're simulacra, they're copies of some sort of principle that no longer exists. It's a lost referential. And what you basically do is, it's a self-defeating prophecy. You indulge in this, which just keeps you within the simulation. And not only keeps you within it, powers the simulation. The simulation is literally powered by you, creating all of these narratives, ideologies, theories about who's in power and how it should change. And in the end,
like the anti-vax phenomenon is like a perfect example of like, fuck the radicalism of like, fuck the system, and like this anger against the system, and this idea of big pharma, and it all happening. And meanwhile, Facebook, like all these different companies, while they're just like, what the fuck do we do? They're also like, this is making us so much money. This radicalism against the system is making the system stronger, because it's creating more echo chambers. It's giving them more sensorial powers to like control the knowledge. And so it's just that radical anti-establishment just ended up making the establishment stronger.
Well, like, it's like the
conspiracy pattern.
Yeah, I mean, like the World Economic Forum says that, like, the times of war leads to industrial economic prosperity. They lead to an upswing in production, of course, except for the country that's being bombed, right? But but in the same way, you reach this prosperity if you have internal war. Of course, you can't keep the state together if it turns into a hot war with armed battle. But if it stays a sort of cyber war, it is an extremely corrosive and destructive force to social cohesion. But it kind of stays within this fake simulated arena in a way, right? And that's what I'm talking about in my course as well. And one of the lectures is called The Ideology of the Machine. And there I'm kind of trying to get at this, look at how all of these different ideologies kind of poke at the same underlying reality, but each of them on their own are just fragments that feed into this machine, right? And so my attempt here is to see technology as some sort of common core basis or like convergent point where all of these different ideologues could potentially agree, or maybe they'd all disagree, but that from which
so
you're
looking for some sort of united front, is it?
Well, that's maybe going too far. I'm looking for a kind of overlapping or convergence point in which all of these ideologies kind of hinge on, because they're all at this point products of the machine, right? And there's this, it's related to the concept of Marshall McLuhan, where he says like the medium is the message, or Neil Postman is his student. And yeah, so I'll definitely put the link in the description for the course for anyone interested.
So what's the course actually going to explore? Is it's looking at the machine?
Yes, so it's looking at the machine from different angles, and beginning with the science, because I think that's the most crucial one to begin with, because we have this paradigm of what is truth and what is falsehood, which is determined by our belief or our fellowship with science, right? And I kind of look at the philosophical underpinnings of science's claim to truth and how that has essentially been abolished after the, let's say, abandonment of metaphysics, of a unifying, grounding, let's say, framework for all of the sciences to fit in. And instead they've become, that's when the area of theory of science kind of arose, because they became different fields that have different methodologies.
And when do you think this happened?
I'd say it was like a progressive kind of thing. It didn't suddenly happen, but I would say that you could say Hegel potentially was the last serious attempt at a sort of metaphysics. Yeah, at a sort of kind of metaphysical system, right?
That takes all the sciences and tries to create something that can bring science and like everything we know about reality into one.
Yes. I mean, arguably, Heidegger's Being and Time also has a similar approach. However, I think Heidegger, in a way, is so post metaphysical that the sciences themselves that Heidegger would ground in this would be different from what we have nowadays as well, and we can't really know fully what that would look like.
And so have you looked at Ken Wilber at all? Because he talks a lot about Hegel in his writings, and it seems like he's very much trying to do that seems to be his project of taking all the knowledge we have. So he had a book called The Theory of Everything, where he tries to create a framework within which we can have all these things and figure out how they relate to each other, and how they're, with his 4 quadrants model, how they're 4 faces of reality facing different directions. So it's like a double Janus. Have you looked at that at all? Because it's an interesting overarching kind of attempt at that.
I have so far not, and that's actually why I wanted to talk to you, because I have so far only had one friend of mine I met at a meditation retreat tell me about Ken Wilber, and then I don't know what it was. I didn't ever look it up, and the other source was literally your videos. Like I literally just looked at the 4 quadrant video, and that's where I also thought that this is an interesting synthesis to look at, is what you know about Ken Wilber. And this specifically also this 4 quadrant, and also what I do with trying to find the kind of the common core, where all of these different ideologies kind of hinge upon, that kind of enable us to describe power. Because I think power is a very difficult concept. It's very difficult to grasp, and I feel like it is something that it's like a convergence point that attaches different systems. So you can look at power from an economic view, from a military view, from an ideological view, political, whatever. There's many different, or interpersonal. I think Foucault would probably say something along these lines as well. And I would be interested in to what extent you reckon you could get a systematic and coherently clear view of power by looking at it through, for example, this four-quadrant perspective.
Yeah, like so, like looking at power through the lens of the four quadrants.
For example, yeah.
Yeah, it just seems like there's such like power would mean something completely different in each of the quadrants, and it kind of goes back to your point earlier of there's so many different games that we're playing in society that it's almost hard to see if those levels of power would overlap. So in the video on Foucault, I kind of explored, or I was just asking the question at the end of like, is this how Jung's gods are constituted? Of like a level of force relations, a level of all these different types of pressure and human interactions that coalesce in and are given a face then by the mythic quality, and from then it's just fed. It becomes concretized and then fed, and then obviously gods are this incredible, like Marx's view of gods. From what I've seen so far with him, I'm just like, you just taken fire back, and you just seem to have forgotten like. You just lost the entire mythic quality, and it's just been reduced to this materialist thing of like God is just this power mechanism used by people to dominate other people. And it's like it just doesn't seem to be a systemic like understanding of gods as being drawn from the unconscious. He's to use Ken Wilber's language, it's been reduced to an external dimension, and it's missed the entire collective internal dimension of the gods and how we project that on them. So I think in that quadrant of like the internal and collective, which would be the lower left quadrant, there is these collective forces of the gods. And Foucault's analysis of power would be this internal collective kind of analysis. In the internal individual, power could be seen as like a spiritual development, or even and spiritual, not just in a more neutral way. So you can think of people like Musk will say people who have very high functioning minds there is a neurotechnology in that, whether it's they're born with it or whether they can develop it, of they've got these powers, these internal powers that they can then bring to the external world. So there's advantages to the way that they're wired. Whether you could look at psychopaths as having just like, if you turn off these empathy functions, then there's just a lot of, which is kind of desensitizing yourself to force relations, of you're not as impacted by other people's opinions. So you're able to kind of like plow on with your own agenda. So you could look at power in that sense, or you could look at spiritual powers and the myths that attach to highly spiritual people and the auras and the incredible powers that they're said to have. Or that we can even observe with Tibetan monks or with people who are very adept.
So it's also like a sort of, you could say like the word empowerment mostly focuses on the internal individual.
Yes, because you bring, like, if you can get that level of empowerment, then there's this idea, even the idea of intention manifestation, of like you empower yourself and then everything just kind of, you just magnetically attract the other things. So yeah, empowerment is a good way of talking about the internal individual element of power. And then with the external individual, I mean, then you've just got all weapons, like all the physical external individual objects that you can use to hold power over others. And you could look at the external collective of something like Facebook or something like these collective governments, just these things with collective power structures that the Marxian kind of superstructure, or the way he looks at capitalism, is this the idea of the machine, the Deleuzian machine. Well, actually, I don't know enough about that to say whether that's collective internal or collective external, but these platforms that have so much power, and it's almost like a transparent thing, because you're not supposed to think about Facebook, you're supposed to think about what your friend is posting or what the conspiracy person is posting. So it's almost this hidden thing, but it structures even the internet itself, the medium of interacting with it. It structures the kind of interaction you can have. The phenomenon of trolls only being created by the possibilities of the anonymity of the internet. So it seems like power is like the word love. It's so important that it's developed a million different there's a million different ways it can be looked at.
Yes.
And
it's like energy in natural sciences, in
Yeah.
physics, like or not just physics. The energy can be stored in chemical energy, and kinetic energy, and potential energy. There's a lot of different ways.
And Foucault directly invokes this when he's talking about power. He kind of
Right.
invokes physics metaphors a lot to kind of speak to this almost. I know people criticize Newton for bringing in this invisible force from a distance. And so gravity was kind of this hidden thing, but we were all in it, and the effects of it were observable. And the reason why it became acceptable was because he came up with the mathematics for it. But Foucault's force relations is kind of like that gravity field of, we're all aware of it. You feel guilt, you feel shame if you step out of line with the social thing, you immediately get snapped with that gravity field. And you could say that psychopaths just have like an anti-gravity machine, or there's an extent to which they can kind of immunize themselves against that, even though they're probably prone in different ways. So yeah, it's just like I do think that Foucault was onto something with this fundamental social energy of like there's this hum, and then that takes on collective dimensions. Even what I was saying with AI, of there's a collective field within which the shepherding of AI was impossible because of market dynamics. So there's capitalism is an entire field of power that structures the way these social programs can happen, so that the second it's like someone's spent 5 or 10 years trying to like be careful with it because they just had so much power anyway that they didn't feel threatened, and then OpenAI come along and the disrupting thing, and then all of a sudden you're back to capitalist dynamics, and now there's a risk, and so the overarching field comes back into play, and then the power dynamics on that collective level structure it so it can only go a certain way. I think Foucault, well, he didn't have enough time to develop. I think it was only 77 when the history of sexuality was published, where he kind of came out with this theory of power. And then
when it was published.
Yeah, so I think it might have been 78 when it was the English.
Because I think you
edition,
just said punished. I thought it was like a
punished, discipline and punish.
and
then it was only like 7 years before. Well, I'm not sure when it was published in French. I think it was 78 when it was published in English. So it could have been even maybe 76 even. But it's only 8 years until he dies, and where he gets the AIDS diagnosis and that. So it's kind of an insight that he couldn't really follow up.
Right.
And I think he kind of had more of a I don't know. I suspect he would have taken it more of a different. He was trying to be more rigorous about it rather than just kind of treating it as this concept of, in a Marxist-y kind of way of like, hey, let's just apply this and fuck the system kind of thing. There seems to be something of like a potential of a science there, a potential of a, because have you looked at Ian McGilchrist much? The whole left-right hemisphere of the brain.
I'm roughly familiar with it, yeah.
So the right hemisphere has been this holistic thinking, but it's vaguer.
Yeah.
And someone used a really good analogy around like a machine learning model that if you train it too close to the data, it's not good. If you introduce random things, it can be bad at figuring out if it fits the data set because it's too tightly correlated to a data set.
It's called overfitting.
Yeah. So the left hemisphere it kind of overfits. So it's very good with a specific data set, whereas the right hemisphere is trying to like keep the model looser so that it
underfits.
It underfits so that it's more applicable in a wider range of things. And it seems to me like theory, or at least these ideas that like Deleuze and Baudrillard and Foucault are coming out with, are more loose fitting. They're more of that right hemisphere. Let's try and get at the big picture. And Ken Wilber's trying to do the same of let's have the audacity to in this age of specialization and trying to get down to the atomic definition of something, let's try and grasp the big picture. Let's have the audacity to fail and come up with that. But then it just hasn't taken on because our society is dominated, which is McGilchrist's thesis, by this left hemisphere, by this overfitting. But we're overfitting to too many different things, and as you say, there's no cohesion between all those things. There's no sense of a whole, so it's kind of fragmented. And so what I like about these thinkers is that they have the audacity to try and bring in this bigger thing, but then there needs to be this pass between the left hemisphere and right hemisphere. So I feel like Foucault's theory of power we kind of need to rigorize it. You know what I mean? It's
Mhm.
important as this like insight, but then can we get more specific about it? Can we look at like what is there some way we can measure this power? Is there some way we can talk about this power that makes it more definable, more graspable, and then we can apply it to the big picture again?
Mhm. Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
keeping it floating as a vague concept, it's great as a mythic kind of oh, I see power everywhere, but is it actually useful in changing the world or in understanding the world around us without actually trying to rigorize it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I understand what you mean. Like, I feel that I feel like the problem with this reductionists, separation, specialization, the problems with that are obviously obvious, I'd say. But what we're getting here is often this dissociation, this deterritorialization. It's kind of part of this entire process that also Deleuze talks about, right? And I think to add to what you said about the right hemisphere, I will probably not be able to address everything you said, but
Yeah.
there is this attempt to reach transcendence, which has now kind of become imminent, paradoxically. So it's like I feel like our thought has been dominated by the, let's say, frontal neocortex, by this cortical thinking, rather the intuitive thinking, had been dominated by that. And now the technological age is adding another layer, which I call the technocortex, right? It's part of our memories are already outsourced to our phones, to our technological devices. A lot of our cognitive powers are outsourced to technological devices. And with the neurotechnology, the internet, and all this, we're kind of adding another layer. We're trying to really escape, let's say, our selfhood into the kind of the machinations of the machine. And that's how these lines of flight, these dissociations come about. And see what happened in the turn of metaphysics with Heidegger was that there was no more such thing as this eternal truth that you can access through thinking about it. But truth was kind of seen as going back to what it originally was meant to have meant, namely aletheia, the unconcealment, it's like a revelatory truth. And this revelatory truth can conceal itself again. It is even necessary that it conceals itself for there to be another revelation of truth in the first place, right? Yeah. And so I think what happens
this is a key point in McGilchrist's book, that he's actually, it's the driving philosophy in it is Heidegger, because he's talking about how the left hemisphere is representational, and how it's linguistic, but it's kind of in an echo chamber of itself. And so the right hemisphere is connected to the body. When we enter novelty, the right hemisphere boots up. When we're in familiar territory, the left hemisphere. So we encounter novelty, and then once we're familiar with it, it comes back. So you get into the clearing, and then once you're kind of aware of it again, though, it slips back into the left hemisphere, the realm of language. But the right hemisphere is the realm of, so left hemisphere is literal language, whereas right hemisphere is metaphor, connotation, poetic, irony, humor, poetry, all these, like the connotations, the opening out that can never be nailed down is the right hemisphere. So it kind of fits very well with Heidegger's thing of getting into that clearing, and how the clearing constantly disappears back into the prison of language, we'll say, or the padded cell.
Yeah, Baudrillard talks about this as well when he actually touches upon information theory, which I work with a lot right now. Namely that this novelty is often represented, for example, in the brain, it's called mismatch negativity. If your prediction that your brain is constantly doing doesn't match the actual perception, you have a sort of mismatch negativity. There's an activity, a spike, metabolism goes up in the brain, and then that's incorporated into the informational structure. And then at some point, if that happens often enough, you kind of adapt to it, right? And it no longer entails that amount of information. And so I wonder if we are progressively becoming more and more simulated and thus closed off, whether then the kind of potential of revelation just kind of grows like a bubble, you know what I mean? Like a growing potential, right? And I would say this, like, eigentliche Selbstsein, that Heidegger calls it, the actual selfhood or the authenticity, where kind of something suddenly shows itself as itself. Whether that is given in these convergence points, like people talk about this technological singularity, but according to their own principles, it's a point of the unknown. You can't make predictions, you can't say anything about it. So we don't even know what this point actually represents. And it's something Deleuze calls very vaguely the body without organs, right? It's kind of and it's retrocausal, so it's in the future and building itself up through the body of capital, right? And Nick Land would go even further. For him, I feel like that's an interesting example of these four quadrants converging in Nick Land, for example. You get this Marxian economic convergence of capital in AI, which he says AI is just a logical consequence of capital moving towards this techno singularity, right? But at the same time, the techno singularity is it's like a quasi-sentient, demonic, mythical entity that builds itself up backwards in time, right? So like it converges. His influence, it's interesting. His influences, among others, are Karl Marx, but also H.P. Lovecraft, right? I just wonder whether there is such a thing in understanding power, because I feel this is specifically a lack in today's age, because you have all these ideologies that all don't really fully grasp it. You have these Marxists or socialists that say power lies somehow in the capital and blah blah blah, and that it just doesn't grasp it anymore. These separate pigs in the top hat bourgeoisie. It's just it's a cliche, it's a meme. It's
an outdated, it's not actually cutting to what's going on today.
Yeah, exactly. And then the same with let's say the mainstream normie position of these elected representatives that are speaking in parliament and this and that, that's where the power lies. That's all. No one really believes that, And then you get the conspiracy views of there's some cabal of this and that group and they've planned everything ahead. That also doesn't cut it. You get a lot of these different.
So there's a search for. So what's your intuition then? Are you looking? Do you feel like there's something more abstract in power, or do you think you seem to have some intuition that maybe you haven't fully articulated? You're searching for an articulation of what it is.
I feel like there was something interesting to be found in the transition from Hegel to Nietzsche, and that is that Hegel kind of had this continuous, thought movement of, negation. It's like a circular movement of negation and double negation and all this. And there seems to be no end. Hegel kind of brought about his own downfall in Marxism. It's almost like the necessary conclusion that out of Hegelianism, Marxism would come, because it was just the dialectical negation of Hegelianism, right? So I feel like what Nietzsche then kind of profoundly discovered is that you have a convergence where these things come to an end, and that is the body. That is, what Hegel's doing. It's just this thought machine. It's just dissociated the thought, the reason from the body, and it's just the thought machine is keep going, But with Nietzsche, there's the final stop, and that's the body. The final stop is when the body dies, right? And that's what then Heidegger further developed. It's the horizon of Dasein, the horizon of Dasein's temporality is death. It's the negation beyond which you cannot negate, or do anything. It's the negation that's beyond your thinking. And so
you think there's some important link? Something happened between Hegel and Nietzsche? There's some relationship between those thinkers that is fruitful.
Yes, or at least as a sort of blueprint, because I feel like in the past there was a better intuitive understanding of power because it was grounded in this more bodily structure, something that maybe Foucault would refer to as biopower, but I'm not too familiar with that.
Biopower is more like the statistical use of medical data, like having all kind of like data farming. Seems to be that's
Okay.
kind of my
Well, then it's
understanding of
different.
biopharma. Yeah.
Well, then it's different. I meant kind of this power, the specific power over bodies, over life and death, right? So this, I think in the past, it was people had a more intuitive understanding of power because you met someone and you just knew whether he's your superordinate or isn't. And it was very clear. And whether they're on eyes height or they're superordinate, because the superordinates in medieval and ancient times, the superordinates, they were in last consequence the ones who would be able to judge your life and death, right?
So the superordinate is kind of the person who's higher up the status hierarchy than you, or is it a specifically spiritual
power?
Just anyone, yeah, who's higher in power than you.
Yeah. And speaking of power hierarchy, that it was more grounded in this intuitive bodily convergence, that it's like, okay, I have control over ending this body, and I don't have control over ending any other body. However, there's someone else who has control over ending my and many other people's bodies.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Which goes all the way from, like we'll say serf to feudal lord, and feudal lord to his king who can send him off to war, who can have him executed for.
Yeah. And I think people like Spengler and Nick Land and stuff, they would say that capitalism, or the modern liberal democratic age, it's not so much a kind of liberation of rights, and I mean that is part of it to some extent, but it's mainly come about by removing all of these, let's say, intuitive, superstitious, irrational restrictions. So like these restrictions on production and on power. It's like, okay, we want as much power accumulated and as much wealth accumulated as much as possible. It makes no sense that this can only be done if you're this firstborn son of this lord who's most likely inbred or something. So like it has removed the restrictions, and now the people who are most power accumulating can get to the position where they are supported in accumulating that power and accumulating that resource. And that has then in turn led to this structure no longer being tied to the body as it used to be. It's like, this is my lord, and this power he has is transferred through blood to his firstborn son. This connection is no longer there. This is my lord. Maybe in 3 years he's not my lord. Maybe he gets kicked out. Maybe he gets voted out by me and my buddies. Maybe.
So the power has just become abstracted then? Like, because there's still that, which is a disembodied principle of it's moved from being embodied in this lineage to being a more abstract thing that different bodies can hold, but that is more perduring. Like it outlasts those bodies, or it continues through those bodies, which is more like Dawkins' idea of a meme, of like mimetic ideas that can spread themselves. And so this is a power thing that has become a meme and then just passes on through it. Like humans kind of pass and go, which fits maybe with, like, have you studied Deleuze's idea of the assemblage much? It's this idea that we don't just live in a field of humans. There's also I think he talks about this famous essay where the guns do have agency. Guns, we even the objects in our surroundings have their own sort of agency, whereas a gun is designed in a particular way that invites you to use it in a particular way. It is trying to get you to use it in a particular way, and just because it was designed by a human doesn't mean that it's not a part of our self. And so he has this idea of the individual. Now, I haven't studied this stuff deeply enough to really know what I'm talking about, but the individual is the breakdown of the individual, because we're dissolved in this field of interpersonal relations, but also it's not just interpersonal, it's there's objects that are part of that agency landscape. And so it kind of expands out. The power becomes not just humans, and not just abstractions as in our ideas, but even the physical objects. So we've moved completely beyond the body into other bodies that, you know what I mean? Like Deleuze does, like with that, he does this very strange thing where you're like, oh, so Yeah, and I haven't studied enough, and I imagine if I go there, it'll be very opaque, and it'll take me a long time to digest. But there's something very interesting in that insight that kind of I imagine it fits with McLuhan's thing. The media is the message. Like there's a certain way that we're conditioned. Like, and this is Foucault's distinction between we often think of power as power over, but it's not just this thing that can stop other people from doing things or force them to do other things. It's also constitutive. Like power creates people in a certain way to see the world in a certain way. Yeah, and so this abstract power that is disembodied, and I guess it was always there even when it was embodied. You know, there's an archetypal glow that we project onto the king around which the psyche organizes itself.
But the archetypes can be seen as like the founding fathers of the Dawkins memes, right? They're in a way like it's like
definitely the major the massive cultural memes like Christianity or
but let's take the great mother archetype or something like that. I would say that's from a time before humans were even capable of conceptualizing. There was already, like you see birds, they don't have a complex grammar language, but they already have signals that represent something akin to mother. Right, and that's kind of the first ones that's the first ones that come about, and you have that well before you had kind of rational thought, and it's something that's also constitutive of mammal societies, kinship systems of relationships and families, and you obviously have that with humans because humans are mammals. And I would say that these are kind of, because they are so archaic, they're in the structure of our base instincts. That's kind of where this whole idea of archetypes comes from. And I'd say that now the idea of memes, they are what has kind of proliferated after that. You know, we have these core memes which are represented by the archetypes, which you can't fully grasp, you can't fully conceptualize, and then from that there's the outgrowth of our thoughts and ideas.
This field of like different archetypal forces. Maybe they'll overlap in different places, and then that's provided as psychical structure out of which these individual memes can kind of play and dance, like bits of clay poked upwards, so they take on particular shapes when really it's part of this underlying substrate, and that's kind of coming out. So it's like that, a dance of but then is it just a constant substructure of the mind then? But anyway,
no, not necessarily. Like it's dynamic. The Jung always said that the unconscious is alive, right? The archetypes are alive, so they're also engaged in a like the gods in ancient times. They're also engaged in a play. They're engaged in a theater, which unfolds and things happen, right? And I think now we have this point of where you know, it's like these big events in the myths. You know, you have this sort of war of the Titans, for example, where the Titans eventually got replaced by the gods of Mount Olympus, right? Which are major events. After that war, Kronos was locked up in the Tartarus. The Titans no longer ruled, and you had the gods. There was a major transition happening there within the unconscious, within the collective unconscious. And I think we are at a similar point with the convergence of technology. We're at the similar point where we have this sort of new being coming about, this new entity coming about. I don't know, are you familiar with the manga Berserk?
No.
Okay, it's you can check it out if you're interested in these things. I'm not a big manga guy. It may sound like it, but it's actually the only one so far I've read. But there's an interesting kind of parallel in this. There are gods in that story, and they seem very inspired by kind of Nietzsche and Jungian thought, but that's just a side remark. But what you said is interesting with the Dawkins memes, that these memes used to maybe be kind of proliferated top down. You know, the memes were kind of, they were concocted within the church, for example, and then spread from.
See, I would be more Jungian from that, where I think it that stuff just bubbles up, and then maybe theologically it can be polished, but for it to have that archetypal resonance, it has to come from that deeper substrate of collective unconscious or something, for it to be like, okay, this kind of fits. Now maybe you could say that Constantine and that generation just kind of looked at a field of memes and then they took which ones they liked and they created a religion out of that and just dismissed what they didn't like. But I still think the original meme, for it to have that virality, for it to kind of glom on, because you can see that when people try and blueprint anything, any kind of like living structure, even like a business, a society, especially, when I think that's part of why socialism often fails, is this idea that you can blueprint a super complex system that is actually so dynamical you're never going to get the calculations. It's
Right.
it has to be a living thing that kind of organically develops. And capitalism in that sense has done very well. Well, capitalism just kind of evolved out of the feudalism kind of faded away, and then with the Enlightenment onwards, you had this emergence of capitalism organically as this, and then it was fed along by whatever energies. And so you wonder to what extent it's. So have you ever heard of spiral dynamics?
Yeah, I've heard of that. Can I just chime in first on what you said? I would say, like, I agree to the extent that, like, the church is the institution that kind of receives, right? It's there. I think Jung speaks about that in Psychology and Religion, where it's like these things, these images bubble up in the unconscious, and they drive you mad, they drive you schizophrenic, and the church is the institution that interprets them for you, right? They channel it. They're the ones channeling. That's what's bubbling up.
That's a good way to put it.
And that channeling used to happen kind of in a way top down. Whereas now I would say it still is in a way top down, but it's so obscure that once you think you've identified the center, it no longer is there. You know what I mean? It's once you think it's the corporate media or whatever, then you go and it's just mirrors and more mirrors. You go there and it's like, okay, you can't find where they're getting their orders from. You know what I mean? You can't find where they're.
And do you think that's so? Because like this kind of brings us back to that idea of power, of having moved away from this embodied, clear lineage. We're in a landscape that has much more diverse games. There's so many different ways to get status, and so many different. When we were talking the Pareto distribution, you were like, all you need to do is get to the top of one, and there's probably 10,000 of them now. So it's hard to know, is that like a subculture that values certain Pareto distributions more, and then how does that subculture fit within the greater culture? Like, so power is. Because I'm just trying to like come back to that idea of how do we approach society with power.
That's how I wonder if we can like get back to some convergence point where it's like, okay, now think about who would be permitted to beat you up and throw you into jail, right? Think of that. Who would be permitted to do that? It's like that individual policeman is not very powerful. The actual person, the actual human coming, dragging you away, beating you up, they're usually not very powerful, right? It's just their job, right? It's just, that's often the category error a lot of activists make.
Well, Foucault would say they were just constituted by the system of police training and the culture of the police force, so that they're actually just a product of this kind of faceless system, that it's not, this is the face you're seeing of this abuse of power, but where is the actual problem?
And in
like
the future,
plateau.
In the future, there won't be even any manager to speak to, right? It'll be all no reception, nothing. It's just like there's this face. Suddenly, people in helmets and whatever come drag you away. No idea who sent them, where, what, who, and it's like that is the essence of this whole dystopian nightmares people have. I think it's a real fear that it's touching. It's this fear of this totalitarianism, and the totalitarianism people have to understand is not the same as authoritarianism. Totalitarianism doesn't necessarily, it can also, but it doesn't necessarily come about with one strong dictator alpha male. You know what I mean? That's an authoritarian trope that comes from the authoritarian monarchical system that was then fusionized with totalitarianism in like the early last century in the different totalitarian regimes. But totalitarianism itself can very much be in an officially democratic system come about, or even more so, because the democratic system is even more interested in controlling your thoughts. It is even more important here that you comply in a system that is so based on the unstable and sensitive dynamics of public opinion and public thought, right?
So this is kind of where Jordan Peterson and we'll say the intellectual dark web of all these people who the uniting thing seems to be their antipathy to political correctness or to social justice warriors. Like that seems to be they seem to be reacting to a fear of, and Peterson coming to the fore with Bill C-16. It's a fear of a totalitarian society that's not necessarily authoritarian. Would that be a good characterization?
Yes, I would say it's a good characterization. However, one thing I'd say where I disagree with your point earlier and where I'd also disagree with the likes of Peterson is that there is some sort of ideal state of capitalism that we are now moving away from, or that provides freedom that's naturally evolved, that we're moving away from. I think a lot of what they attack, what they criticize, are very much products of what a lot of people would consider capitalism, right? A lot of what he criticizes, I would claim, is not really some, secret Politburo of postmodern neo-Marxists that have written down their manifesto and their base principles.
Yes.
It is more or less a byproduct. It's a byproduct of the commoditization of education, the mass industry that is university, which just kind of promotes ideologies that are like consumer products. They're consumer commodities that mainly provide for compliance and for maintenance of this educational system. And it
doesn't, and it's no longer because of that like farming that the education systems become. These people are no longer offered a home within academia to kind of develop those thoughts and rigorize them. It's kind of, you got 4 years, we're going to charge you $100,000, we're going to fill you with this stuff, and then we're going to throw you out the door and offer you no job and leave you in a state of precarity, out of which all you can do, like you don't have time to really process what's happened.
And all after that, it's like, okay, I'm doing terribly. And all you've learned while you're doing terribly is it's the white man, or it's, capitalism, or patriarchy, or whatever. Whichever of these things. And these are just like the other theories I mentioned earlier, not very good theories of power. They don't cut it, they don't cut it really. It's like, how'd you say, there's been many, many times where the society was way more obviously patriarchal than it was now, where it would have been a way more suitable and useful kind of mode of analysis than now. It's you can always find some similarities, you can always find some patriarchal structures left here and there and this and that, but like compared to society like Afghanistan or something, where you do
100%. We're not living in it's not. If you look at history, there are very obvious examples of patriarchy.
Yes, but whenever someone has power, or like whenever someone's seen powerful, nobody nowadays cares about who their firstborn son is. You know what I mean? Nobody, which would be kind of, for me, a necessary ingredient to have in a patriarchal system.
But there's something, and I think this comes back to your point about finding the convergence point. There's an intuition there about some kind of power, or some kind of way the system favors its bias, it leans a certain way. It's kind of dramatized into this thing of men are evil or white people are evil, but there's like these slight gradients within the system that statistically at a certain level favor a certain gender or certain people, but it's not this patriarchal man on top next part, like I made an episode about womanism versus feminism, which was actually a bit of an oversight because there's actually a movement called womanism. But I was kind of going with this idea of, Elizabeth Holmes. She founded that company and became a billionaire, a Theranos or whatever it was called. And it was just turned out to be a shell of a thing. And she is an epitome of this patriarchy idea, even though she's a woman. So it's like, it feels like the patriarchy idea, it's something more insidious. And maybe we could go to the Jungian like masculinism as a better characterization, but even then, it's this power that we're dealing with is more subtle. It's more insidious, and we don't have the language for it yet. And it seems like these are like really stereotyped ways of big baseball bats for attacking something that is like tiny and very nimble and protean and slips out of your reach once you try and grasp it, because it seems to have so many sides. So yeah, and then that's just led to a culture war, which only feeds the system itself and actually is taking everyone's attention away from it because it just brings them to these battle lines. And it
runs on simulations, right? Like Baudrillard even talks about that. He said that ironically, the activist groups from universities, they've kind of run out of fuel. They've run out of things to be activist about, and now it's kind of they create the simulacrum of an opponent, the simulacrum of an enemy. And even Chomsky would say something along the lines that, you know, it's mischaracterization to say that the power structure of capitalism, that it favors racism or favors this and that. It favors whatever favors its mode of production. So for a certain time, racism was useful to the capitalist production, and right now, anti-racism has become useful for the mode of production. Right,
which Bo Burnham does a great thing on in his special Inside. I don't know if you've seen that, but he just does this being the representative, talking about this representative of like a marketing representative of some big company, and it's just like an ad, and he's talking about some really major social issues, but then it's about like selling crackers or something, you know what I mean? It's this cracker company. It's like, what have you got? What are you doing? Because it's just this way of like,
it's like Gillette or Pepsi Cola, and they all have these actions,
like the equivalent of greenwashing, whatever woke washing, I guess. We can use that now. Yes, that's good that'll help us with sales, so we'll use that. And it's this cynical, jaded thing of like, it's actually just about capital and how can we increase the bottom line? And that's what capitalism wants to do. It's kind of neutral in that sense. It doesn't really give a shit one way or the other about the activist cause. It's just, and Ken Wilber has an interesting analysis actually where he talks about the oppression of women, where he says that like back in the days of horticulture, so when before agriculture, before the plow, all you needed was like a stick and so a hoe and you just drop the seeds in the ground. So, and because we were hunter-gatherers, like it was the women that were actually doing this. And so I think 2/3 or more of the gods at this time were female. So it was the great mother societies, the matriarchal societies. But then once the plow came in, if women were driving the plow, then they'd have miscarriages. So it was men that started to drive the plow. So the men started to get control, and then the gods changed and they became male gods, and it was the tyrannical male gods that emerged. And then we had the agricultural phase coming right up to, we say, modernity. And then as work moved away from needing like heavy, intensive power of agriculture, we'd say 90% of people were living on farms at the turn of the 19th century. At that point, when physical strength was no longer needed, then the system could adjust. And it seemed like it was then that feminism could happen. So for Wilber's thing, he analyzes this oppression of women as actually just being that the system put them in certain places because that was what was required. And so it was only as the external system, we'll say the collective external organization of society changed, that all of a sudden women could become free. So women couldn't have become free 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago because of the way that the system was structured, unless you were an upper class woman in the sense of being liberated from work or from doing work that wasn't that. So the system demanded a certain type of thing, and then that led to the creation of gods that mirrored that image of society.
And you got to remember that like oppression is always kind of tailored to the particular group. Like I would say in a certain way, everyone is or has been repressed in a lot of ways. Like the most important example is, of course, warfare. Like the lives of men have historically been so expendable. Like the lives of the decisions being made always would readily calculate in a third of our young men population dying. That's that's just calculated in. Whereas you'd never kind of dare to do that about women, because that would lead to the end of your society if you have just half of them dying, right?
It takes one man can impregnate a whole village, whereas it does not work the other way around. One man can only have one kid at a time.
So you had specific oppressions, I would say, which is that's the thing, that's this difficult kind of structure which you can't really summarize in these simplified views, where you can, like I said, this views you get at university also don't cut it anymore. And to a point just earlier that I wanted to address, when you said this natural development of capitalism, I would kind of question that to an extent, where I would say an interesting way to think about it, and this is also not in any way universal theory of power, but there's this idea of the cathedral and the bazaar, or the empire and the village, you know? And I would say that, like, instead of talking about the deep state, it's interesting to look at history and think about the deep empire, right? And that's, I think, an interesting way to look at it without, like you said, this broad, what was it, left or right hemisphere? This broad.
The right hemisphere is the holistic.
The right hemisphere, yeah. The holistic way of looking at it, where you don't get into specifics. So if you're a conspiracy theorist, you can claim the deep empire is the same group throughout history. You can claim they somehow kept a continuity, but we don't know. So we stay with this model of the deep empire as being vague enough to be like, it could be the same group, it could be entirely different people every time.
Which I could see as like a Jungian or Foucault, like it's an abstract power thing that's continuing through time, and everything else can change. All the details can change. It doesn't need to be this linear blood relation. It's almost like we want to put agency on something. We want to put a face on it. So because we interact with faces. So the conspiracy mindset wants to do that, but we have this lineage coming from Sumeria. Yeah.
And if you look at the rise of capitalism, you know, I would say it's hard to think of it as a natural development if it coincided very much with the rise of the British Empire, right? It's very much the rise of the first Navy empire. And thus the possibility of Navy travel is in a way quick, because it's like you can go straight from one end to the other, and you can transport huge amounts, which you couldn't just put on horse carts, right? That this kind of free trade was also brought about by massive wars, right? Like the Opium War in China, massive wars, conquests. The origins of capitalism you find in these companies like East India Company, the Hudson Bay Company. These are the biggest, if you adapt it to today's currency, these are the biggest companies in history. They are bigger than Apple if you take the currency value. They had entire army ships. They committed entire genocides in colonies, right? So I would say that, like, you always have to look at both forces, the bazaar and the empire, right? The bazaar is this, like, the price is made right in the negotiation.
So we're saying like, East India Company is the bazaar and the British Empire is the empire. Is that what we mean, or?
I would say that the East India Company itself is probably part of the empire, but it's like it was there to flatten the ground to then establish the rules for the bazaar, you know, you could say. And so that then you can ask yourself, then, is the elite, have they fully been swapped out? Was it an elite first that was based on royal blood, and then in this transition went over to people, to like lobbyists and aristocrats tied to parliament, tied to merchants, tied to the standing army? And the nobility in England were a long time against the perpetually standing army, because it was then used by the parliament to exert power over the nobility, over the old structure. And
that's exactly what happened in Rome, yeah.
And in order to finance the standing army, they had to like colonize other places, right? So the interesting thing is the colonization didn't just start from the kings and the old system. It was actually a modernization of the British, the Kingdom of England, right? And in that way, it's I would say it's interesting to look at it also from this point. But then, like I said, I'm not exactly sure what the right mode of analysis is. Is it the right mode of analysis to look at it from this historical political view of like the British Empire, which then transitioned when it came to like the next stage of capitalism, which would be this, you could say, this sort of globalization. Then the empire slowly transitioned towards the United States, right? Then it slowly transitioned. Instead of going and conquering places, you now include them into international institutions, into the World Trade Organization, into the UN, into the NATO, into all of these different institutions that are regulated by non-elected elites, so to say, right? This is kind of what. This is a very broad explanation of what we're kind of doing now.
Yeah, it's interesting because that's like that's follow the money. That's kind of what that is. But I would still see it. To me, there's still something. natural is obviously the wrong word to use in any of this, but there's something organic in all of that. Like it seems like even if it was blueprinted at first, it seems to have taken on a life of its own very quickly, and it wasn't organically transplanted around the world. It just kind of, there was trade barriers, and then it wanted to go there, and then it just, like a virus, just found its way in and infected everything.
A fungus.
A fungus actually is the better way, because virus implies usually something entirely negative, whereas the mycelial network that is just searching for ways to expand its life force, that seems to be what capitalism has done. And yeah, it's hard to see that as a blueprinted process, as like a created thing, even if we can say that there's the creators of, and AI is probably going to mirror this process of like, we're creating it, but already there's emergent functions. Like they were saying, Sam Altman was saying that the capabilities of GPT to GPT-3 to summarize long things of text, like they didn't program it to do that. It was just like an emergent function that came out of, and so we're bringing in more and more systems or more AIs together, talking together, and combining it with everything that's going on with the internet. We're probably going to see more and more emergent things coming out, and it would be hard to call that planned, rather than like there's a degree to which it was planned of like, oh yeah, like there's money in this direction, or there's technological advancement, so there's money in this direction still. But it's like you're giving birth to something that you're not aware that you're giving birth for. You're trying to chase some like status or money in the human realm, but then this extra human entity is going to come into being. In the case of capitalism, in the case of the British Empire, it was capitalism. In the case of what we're doing now, it's AI and whatever lies beyond the singularity, whatever transformation happens there. There's something.
But would you say that extra human entity? Would you agree that extra human entity, though, still would make a distinction between its subjects and its high priests? You know what I mean? Like, speaking in metaphors now, that like you had this, like the capitalism, the first stage capitalism with the British Empire spreading like a fungus, and in a way developing a dynamic on its own, of course. But the high priests of that development were not the average British people, the average English people, the average Irish, Scottish people. The high priests of that were a very small group compared to the populations, a very small group of aristocrats and merchants, right? And that's some sort of, I don't want to get too deep into this iron law of oligarchy or something, but that's something that you see throughout, and that's the basis, I think, for people believing in a continuity of the deep empire, so to say, of saying that it's the same group, which we don't really know. Like I said, I won't definitely deny it or definitely affirm it, but it's kind of something that goes parallel. You have this sort of monarchical structure, you have the people, and like there's always this tension in between, and usually the compromise is like a group of people and a group around the monarch being a permanent kind of.
So does this? Have you ever heard of like the meta-modern movement? So there's this guy Hansi Freinacht, or it's really this guy Stefan Gortz. I think he's a Swedish academic who writes under this pseudonym, but it's a meta-modern character creation called Hansi Freinacht, but wrote this amazing book called The Listening Society, which is kind of about meta-modern politics, very much just taking Ken Wilber's ideas and evolving them more into kind of more, bringing in more left-wing political kind of strain to it.
Meta-modern, I'll write it down.
So the book is The Listening Society. He has a website called Meta Moderna. Brilliant stuff. But one of the ideas he has in the book is the meta-modern aristocracy. And he says that these are the three groups that are at the cutting edge of meta-modern culture and who will shape it the most. Doesn't mean that they've got the most capital. It just means that they understand the world the most, and so they're most likely to influence it the most. And the groups were the hippies, the hipsters, and the hackers. And you can think of the hipsters as the quote unquote social justice warrior, as being understanding the culture, being the most understanding the all the nuances of the political landscape, we'll say, in terms of what's culturally appropriate and where the culture is going. You've got the hippies, who are kind of like the Burning Man kind of culture of figuring out alternative ways of living, psychedelics, meditation, these kind of psychotechnologies. And then you have the hackers, who are the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Steve Jobs, the Sam Altmans, the people coming up with AI. So it seems that in this case with AI, the nobility, or the high priests, are most definitely this hacker subculture, who they might not have the capital yet, but you go 10 years down the line and people with PhDs in AI are probably going to do quite well, while a lot of other software developers, will say, or a lot of people in other job places who are not at this cutting edge and might be in high management positions right now, they might have more capital, but these people have meta-modern social capital, which will kind of stand to them in the next couple of decades. And so, yeah, it seems like that these will be the high priests, the people gathered who are at the cutting edge of this technology and who are shaping it, will inevitably be the high priests, because they're going to be the ones speaking to us as experts about it, and who are shaping the system itself by doing whatever level of programming they are putting into it. So that there will be that, and then the rest of us are the subjects who are just kind of passively consuming, or at the will. There's this tidal wave coming, and we're going to surf it as well as we can. Whereas they have some degree in shaping what the height and frequency of that wave is.
So here's, I think, a very good point. You make a very good point. I think it's a very good point to illustrate the example of what I've been talking about where with power, if we don't reach a certain convergence point, like the power of over your life and death and stuff, that it's not clear what system to use as the lens or the mode of analysis. So now in this case, you speaking of the hackers, it's a very valid way of looking at it, but in my intuitive way, because I probably just read slightly different things or here and there, blah, blah. My intuitive one would be looking way more at the financial sector, right? Because I look at like what controls the entire economy, what controls the way we live and this and that is very much dominated a lot by like who sets the interest rates, who regulates the industry, who regulates the financial sectors, who gets to take out which loan of trillions to give to these different corporations, to tech or whatever, to wars. And this is obviously a class and elite that has risen more to prosperity, to power over the last few centuries. But then the question is here, like, is this two parallel systems of power to look at? Are both valid? Do they kind of translate? Is there a function between them that translates, that mediates? Is one of them more valid than the other? Are the financials more important to look at than the hackers? Or is it something like you are saying, where the hackers are becoming the high priests and they may actually, through crypto or something, replace the financial elite, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a degree of, obviously hackers can become that elite. Like if you look at Zuckerberg, Jobs, like these people became, they became as wealthy as any of the, and as wealthy and as powerful in that domain as any individual in the financial district. But no, because you could say, yeah, but again, I think it's the abstract power structure of capitalism and the state that kind of structures that power. So it's not to do with individuals again, but there's a greater power to which even these individuals, as my point with Google and AI, I've just been like, okay, we have to throw caution to the wind now and try and get in, because they're beholden to a greater power structure, which isn't necessarily an individual. Like it's not necessarily the head of the Federal Reserve who's now determining, you know, he can change the interest rates, but Powell isn't in charge of, you know what I mean? He's not the person pulling the puppet strings, and neither is Klaus Schwab. So it's the different people have different levels of input, but there's a system that they're influencing by throwing laws up or throwing interest rates up. But it's part of this more imminent field of force relations, as Foucault was talking about. It's just throwing something into a complex field of interrelations, and it's having ripple effects. But there's no, so it's hard to talk about someone being more powerful than Mark Zuckerberg or being more powerful than Sam Altman, or, you know, having more control than these individuals, because it's I don't think there's any other individual that's necessarily got a power that's definitively more than them. Because say I watch this podcast, the All In podcast, which is these kind of Silicon Valley insiders, and they're all venture capitalists. So they're funding all these different companies, but they've made their money through the Silicon Valley system itself. So they're hackers who are now creating the next generation of hackers. They've become the finance side coming through the hacker thing. So there is this fluidity between the financial and the hacker, but it's all part of this greater system of which, yeah, you can say, is it their technical knowledge that makes them powerful, or is it their financial power? Because someone with just finance but no technical know-how isn't going to pick the right companies to make more money, which then become the big platforms which influence the direction of power in future. So there's like a fluidity between, like, I don't think it's an either or. I think that these powers work together, and yeah, it's hard to distinguish where that power ends and the other one begins. Like there's an overlap, and then there's a greater background of the culture itself. Like crypto, people tried to get it to catch on, but it started with a great idea and was trying to like build a bridge back to the people, rather than social media kind of starting with the people and then growing organically from there. So it's kind of got to come from this grassroots thing of being ready, it being the right time and all that. So there's also the power that the people have by actually getting what's going on with the technology and then adopting it. So people got ChatGPT very quickly and they were like, oh wow, this is amazing. So it spread fast through the environment, whereas Bitcoin, we're still just like, it seems like a great idea, but we're kind of waiting. So I think that for me, it's a very messy thing of like the abstract power and the solid power. And
yeah, I would say that like in a lot of cases, one shouldn't underestimate the degree to which structural power can crush this individual power. You have it very explicit in places like China, where a multi-billionaire could be sent to prison the next evening because they break some sort of code of conduct, whatever. But I can imagine a similar thing in the United States. Imagine like one of the billionaires that
it's happening with TikTok. We'll say the CEO of TikTok, like the US are more or less shutting down TikTok as part of this war with China. You know what I mean? So they're kind of there's a structural crushing going on there.
That is an example, but I mean, like in a lot of way, the individual powerful people, billionaires, whatever, they serve and they're useful to the power structure, to the, let's say, these people that got rich on the bazaar, like Trump may be a good example. In some way or the other, they serve the cathedral, they serve the system. If they were directly opposing it, the system would try by all means to crush them, to remove them, right? Right now, I would say even people who are, sometimes edging against it, like Elon Musk or something, there's still enough, like it doesn't outweigh the amount to which it serves the system to an extent, like Neuralink and space technology and all these things, to which extent it serves it. And so I don't know.
Are you saying the structure is trying to crush Musk, or that Musk is the structure in that sense?
No, I would say that most of the people who are like have individual power and influence, they usually can only garner individual power and influence through the bazaar, right? They can only garner through their own entrepreneurial spirit, through their own wits, whatever, or even ruthlessness, whatever. They can garner through that, whereas to get this sort of structural power, you have to basically comply. You have to basically try and it sounds strange, but submit your way up the ranks, the thing is that
you have to agree to be formed by the system. You got to be constituted in the right form so that you can kind of float into the right places where you want to get the power. Yeah,
and as the kind of cathedral system is in a way parasitic, it's not very productive, it's not very organic or natural, whatever. It kind of relies on it needs a bazaar to still exist, it needs the bazaar to still be there. It needs to be allowing for a certain amount of Elon Musk's and whatever, like people with their own minds coming about and getting powerful to some extent. However, it also wants to make sure that is the regulatory, the security system, to be able to crush them if they become dangerous, if these individual powerful people become dangerous. Luckily enough for the power structure, an individual person to become so powerful to suddenly overwhelm the system is very rare in history. You get, Caesar, Napoleon figures and whatever, but it's generally rare in history. So oftentimes these people will have some squabbles. I think with Musk, it's a superficial squabble to an extent. If there was an actual threat, I'm not so sure if you could still maintain what you just said, that these are the most powerful people, because if there was an actual problem with the power
Trump is arguably a better example than Musk, where the system is actively the white blood cells of the structure, because he's like drain the swamp. Like, let's get rid of these people. The election was a fraud. Like, he is actively trying to take down the system in his own way. There's a radical anti-establishment thing in him, and he's so powerful coming from his background, but now with this Republican base that he is mobilized. And then you've got the system that is just like the white blood cells are just like the mainstream media, the political, like the legal system, everything is trying to go after him. So there is this sense of him, he is kind of the thing that they're trying to shut down. Like, yeah, there's the mainstream media has kind of rejected Musk, but there's no sense of anyone coming down on any of his companies because he's so useful to the system that it's kind of like, yeah, we'll attack you, but what are we going to do? Like, you're not doing anything that like completely breaks the rules, whereas Trump is kind of breaking the rules, and so the structure is trying to crush him in a way.
Yeah, crush them or also pacify them. Like, there's often these cases of these uprising people, and then after a few years, the kind of wind leaves the sails. They kind of become more tame, more collaborative, more kind of ready to compromise with the cathedral, the power structure, with everyone.
He doesn't seem like someone that can be pacified, but maybe his base, like with someone like Ron DeSantis, they could maybe be pacified a bit. But
also, he's very old, right? He's very old. Like, I think it's especially as he had a term in office, you can kind of see that it's a very limited threat. It's a very, it's.
Yeah, what he did when he was actually, but it's not so much what he did when he was in power, so much as the handover of power, the attempt to undermine the democratic institutions or questioning the institutions. There's something very much.
It's paranoia. It's a paranoia for someone doing that and actually succeeding, right? This paranoia over that, whereas Trump, I think, was realistically speaking far from succeeding. But like, I think they're terrified of someone coming along, maybe younger, maybe more charismatic, maybe, and actually succeeding with this, or actually becoming.
Because there is like, balance. If you're talking about power, it's very interesting to look at the Republican voting base, because they're rural, ex-urban. Like, I think 84% of the counties of America voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020. I think it was maybe 83% in 2020. And it's just this rural ocean, or this rural or ex-urban ocean of people who have been left behind. So in 2020, they were only that 50% of the population, give or take, were only 29% of America's economic output, while representing 83% of its counties. So you've got this group of people that have been left behind by the system. The urban America is like trailblazing ahead with its secular values and its progressiveness. And then you've got this rural ocean that's just kind of like, there's this power building there. And that like Trump was the first release of that energy, but the system hasn't found a way to accommodate itself to it. And so I feel like there's a type of power there that is so small, because again, they don't have the most economic output. They're in lesser densely populated areas. But you've got something like Fox News, which is just like pouring fuel over this, and it's just turning up the power of it by turning up the like irrationality and the fury of these people. So it's creating a power out of this sort of this weakly connected thing, and it's just creating this thing that can now become this, that can stand against the system, that managed to get a reality TV star, because without Fox News it never would have happened. Take a reality TV star and get him into the White House. It's kind of that as a form of power in itself, which you could just say is the top down from an institution like Fox News. But there was already this radical feeling of being left behind, feeling of being judged, feeling of like, yeah, you're a racist, you're this backward, like redneck, and you want to get back to the days of the Confederate. Like there was that low-lying energy that is kind of like there in the South, but then it's spread across America in this rural ocean. That there's so many layers of power within that you could analyze. And like so
and it's always irrational. It's always irrational. Like, how would you say, power from the outside, especially when you strive for it, it's always an irrational sentiment. Like, you can never, from the rationality of the system, reach some sort of coherent way to power or coherent justification to attempt to gain power or something like that. It's because the rules of how that works is always set by the current power structure, right? So like you can see those both perspectives looking at power very differently. For one of them, it's an irrational thing. They want this savior figure, to fulfill their demands. It's like in a way, it's a means to an end. They want the safe, stable Christian, good old America to be fixed and saved by this person they kind of irrationally project their hopes into. Whereas the other side, because they are in power, or like because they are from within power, and there's the question, is that already like a, very subjective view of mine? Is that already something you can criticize? Is there another way to look at it? Blah, blah. Because, like I said, it's not an easy topic, but because they're in power, their approach to it is very differently. For them, it's not means to an end, it's an end in itself, right? Because it's just like they looking at their opponent, they don't look at them as an equal arms wrestling opponent, or like the MAGA Trump people would do, as some sort of irrational evil entity or something like that. They actually kind of look down on them, right? It's more like, it's
condescension,
it's condescension. It's like these people are backwards, racist, religious, the dumb, uneducated, lower class rabble. That's kind of the attitude. Is more
it would never be
that.
articulated to that level, but it's quite close to being articulated. In different ones of those terms will have been used to describe this ocean, and
it's like peasants.
Which actually in one of the videos that'll be coming out in the next few weeks, I kind of talk about this interesting thing of Marx. A guy wrote an interesting article on Marx and the peasantry, because Marx just dismissed them. He called them rural idiots, barbarism within civilization, and he was just like, they will never, they're not a revolutionary class. They're just conservative reactionaries. But every successful communist revolution has had to unlearn that lesson. So Lenin, after the failed 1905 uprising, he was just like, oh, we need the peasantry. There isn't going to be a successful revolution without the peasantry. And so it spent the next 12 years like mobilizing the peasantry. And that's what won them power. And the same in China, Mao learned from Lenin, the same in South America. And so it was this, instead of seeing the rural peasantry as being conservative reactionaries, I was kind of playing with this idea of, well, what if the far left, we'll say the progressive, the democratic socialists like Bernie, AOC, they're not going to win power from the center left, like the actual Democratic Party, but they've got this radicalized countryside of people who, if you can win them away from the kind of fascistic kind of mirage that they're caught in, there seemed to be an opportunity. It's completely past, but there could have been an opportunity there for a progressive thing, but instead it was again focused on the urban poor rather than the rural poor. And so it went towards a kind of a more progressive, focusing on minorities rather than looking at hey, if we wanted to get power, and this guy kind of referenced, he was kind of saying, well, where the socialists kind of tried to keep being good Marxists, the communists became Leninists and were just focused on power for its own sake. And I was like, that's an interesting way of putting it. He was explicitly saying that they kind of set aside, or to some extent set aside the Marxist thing to focus on getting power, and became much more strategic so there's an interesting. And then
the culmination with Stalin, right, where essentially then you started purging all the conflicting groups, and you just get to good old autocratic. Good old autocratic leadership of military reinforcing your own power, completely disregarding any sort of ideological principles that you've read or something.
Which is that where power wants to go in the end? Does it want to just consume does it want to mop the floor? But I kind of looked at made an episode looking at comparing humans to bacteria. There's this like bacterial growth curve where bacteria adapt to an environment, and then once they fully adapt it, there's the log phase that just massively explode, and then there's stationary phase and decline. And I was kind of looking at humans through that lens, because people say the humans are this cancer on the earth, and it's like, well, probably more bacteria like following that bacterial curve. And I was kind of looking at the wolves or the elk in Yellowstone. That, I don't know if you've come across that story of Trophic Cascade. The elk just overgrazed the shit out of the entire national park, and their numbers were doing these spikes. But there was, because there was droughts and stuff, there was cullings. But once they stopped the cullings, the numbers were just going up. And so I think that like this curve is actually just without ecosystem constraints, that this is the natural growth pattern. And so that's kind of, maybe that's what power wants to do. It wants to have, but without an ecosystem of restrictions that prevents it. But once you get that feedback loop where it's just off by itself, then the power just concentrates itself, because that's what it's trying to do. And it's used to being in an ecosystem of competing powers against which it has to restrain itself. And so
that's also what grounds our current view of what intelligence is. Like artificial intelligence, in a sense, does nothing else but rationalize and control in form of information as much as possible, and more and more and more as possible. These language models keep growing so they can process more information, control more information. And the thought is there that at some point an intelligence will just try and intelligize everything until there's nothing left, and then it becomes self-destructive. It's kind of intelligence for its own sake has a thirst for its own annihilation, and that is because the notion of intelligence is tied to this abstract idea of power. It's tied to this. Intelligence is this power to incorporate as much things as possible within an informational system, right? And this is very different from other forms of under-conceptualizations and forms of intelligence. If there's such a thing as emotional intelligence that's driven by compassion, by love, and these kind of things, I don't want to put an idealistic counter image, but that would be very different. That would obviously not be intelligent in this rational, informational, systematic way. It would be intelligence in a very different way, and it would also look very differently. It would be incapable of just being simulated in a machine. It would have to be at least some sort of healthy symbiosis between humans and techniques. It would have to involve humans to the extent that humans rely on one another, that humans are made to be vulnerable and limited and contradictory and combining many different factors. Whereas machines, they're built for a purpose.
Human nature, and
machines are built for a purpose.
Well, that seems like a good time to segue into a kind of a wrapping up.
Yes.
So to talk about your course again, that kind of those threads kind of are what you're exploring with the course, right? The techniques and the machine and the relationship with that.
Exactly. That's just to mention again, 14th of May is when we're beginning. Link will be in the description.
And is it just a one-off course, or is there a few installments?
Oh, it is a few installments. It's 6 weeks, every time on Sundays. And it's basically a seminar discussing text we're reading. There's going to be a major text for each installment. For the part on science, we're going to read Edmund Husserl, The Crisis of European Sciences. For the part on ideology, we're going to read Gilles Deleuze, The Postscript to the Societies of Control. On the technology, we're going to read Man and Technics by Oswald Spengler, as well as The Question Concerning Technology by Heidegger. We're going to read Introduction to Systems on the system of technology, a system of the machine. And we're going to read The Undiscovered Self by Carl Jung for the myth part. It'll end up in this myth of the machine, which is kind of the opening up of the systemic thought to what lies outside of the system, which can only be mediated and formulated via myth. And that's kind of yeah, that's kind of how it's structured, and that's kind of how one can look at it, especially in regards to all these, questions that, coming back to the very beginning of our talk, that are currently tackled in this analytic but fantasy sci-fi way, where it's like, ethics of AI and existential risk of this super mega AI, but there's no actual understanding from within thought of what it actually means, this technical system that is upon us. And yeah, that's basically what we're getting into there.
Cool. I'd love to join you, but for those 6 weeks I'm going to be hiking in Spain, so
oh yeah, how long will that be going on for?
Yeah, so I'm leaving tomorrow, and I will be back in the middle of June. So yeah, 6 weeks roughly, give or take.
Wow.
I have a few rest days along the way, but yeah, I haven't been on that big of a hike since before the summer, before I started the channel.
Right.
Just went on a 40-day hike along the west coast of Ireland, and yeah, kind of just had a bit of a lot of epiphanies around that. Was just writing a lot of poetry and kind of just getting into a very different mindset. So I'm kind of looking forward to kind of tuning out and seeing just kind of letting the things that inputs I've taken over the last while kind of click together and see if we can have a more holistic kind of perspective emerge. So,
and you going on your own?
Yep. So my mother's going to join me for the first week, and then there's a group. So I've been doing it with a group over the last few years, since 2018. So we were doing our last week together, or the last couple of weeks, and so I was like, I'll just, if this is gonna be the last year we're doing it, I'm gonna try and do the whole thing. So yeah, I'll probably have 3 or 4 weeks there in the middle where it's just me. But Camino is very social. There's so many people that do, and they're like generally lovely, interesting people. So yeah,
I'd love to do it sometime. Yeah, that sounds
I would highly recommend it. Even just the first week is amazingly scenic. Like, first day you come over the Pyrenees and come down to Roncesvalles, like really, really old monastery. It's where Charlemagne beat the Moors. So the kind of the beginning of Western civilization. And yeah, so it's and then you're coming across the north of Spain, and it's just, weather's beautiful, place is beautiful, it's nice and affordable, and people are amazing. And it's this sense of pilgrimage. Even though most of the people you meet are secular, there's still a sense that everyone is on searching for something. There is a pilgrim undertone going through it, which I haven't seen with Leipzig. So yeah, unfortunately I'll miss your course, but I'll be off trying to find my mythos.
Yeah, that's very good. That's very good. Very good to end on, I'd say.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that chat. Kind of touched so many different topics that I'm fascinated about, and kind of thinking about a lot about AI recently, but to bring the postmodernism and integral, and try and really hammer out more of Foucault's idea of power, that was just a delight. So thank you.